So I figure we can try to define justice and try to define it in a way that that doesn't often get talked about, and maybe opens our eyes and sort of creative juices to thinking about the problems that you're all trying to solve in a slightly different way. This isn't about work that's happening on the ground, so the translation piece I think is up to each of you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts today or later about how translation can happen. So that's the plan. Restorative energy justice, this energy justice idea is actually relatively new. You might be surprised to know, those of you who've been working so hard on it in the Energy Equity Hui, the first time anybody wrote down the words energy justice was only about 12 years ago. And then, it's sprouted from there, but there've been a lot of ideas about what is it, right? What is energy justice? Is it an outcome and how do we get there? And when you get a difficult problem like this, my sort of go-to, my safety blanket, is I go back to the great thinkers of the past and try to look at how they've asked similar questions and then try to translate those into this modern energy context. So how about James Baldwin as somebody who, both in his lived experience, but also in what he wrote and what he thought about in his scholarly enterprises, um, justice was at the core of what he was experiencing and thinking about. And what he said in a series of essays called No Name in the Street was that if you want to know what justice is, don't go ask the lawyers, that's me. Don't ask the judges, don't ask the policemen, don't ask the middle class. You have to go and ask the people who are living in an unjust existence. And so, in some ways, I envision all the work that you folks are doing as really just asking questions. And what we have to figure out is how do we ask the right questions to get useful answers that we can make progress on this sort of quest of justice and equity and fairness. Um, so James Baldwin in the back of my head, what questions do we ask? And then you go, and I'm still a reader, so I'll go and read other work. Like I'll go and read some work from 2014 in a book by Benjamin Sovacool and Mike Dworkin, where they tried to define energy justice and they gave it 10 principles, right? 10 principles that define justice, some of which I think are baked right into the energy equity like docket and the WHOI's mission. Things like affordability and fair processes and transparency and availability of energy, let alone clean energy. Here's the problem, I think, with that approach. And in some ways, what has been a drag on this entire effort statewide is that if we were to keep going down this path, I think that just with the 35 people we have here today, we would come up with a list of principles that is hundreds of entries long. And so we haven't really narrowed down to figure out what are those questions we really need to get answers to? What are the things we should be asking about? And so I take a step back from this, even though this is viewed as sort of the foundational scholarly work on energy justice. I think we should take a step back and think about justice in lots of realms, not just energy. And the environmental movement has been doing this for a couple of decades, right? Going back to first principles. And so one of the articulations of what environmental justice is, which is separate and apart from energy justice, is that it has three components. And a distributive justice, which is, I think, what most people think about when we think about justice, the idea of how we distribute benefits and burdens across our society. That's certainly a piece of the justice, and it informs things like affordability, obviously. The second piece that gets a lot of attention is procedural justice. How do we just make sure that we incorporate all perspectives? And listening to James Baldwin's message, how do we make sure we incorporate sort of marginalized perspectives in in those decision-making processes? And I know that there's a lot of work that's been happening at the PUC and elsewhere on that front. But the third piece, and what a couple of smart lawyers from Europe mentioned a few years back, I think 2018, they said, there's a third component here called restorative justice, and that hasn't yet been interrogated or evaluated in the energy realm. It's really only, I think, maybe the past 2, 3 years, I've seen a lot of folks looking into this, folks like Layla, who are trying to carry it forward in a place-based way. So that's sort of my question there is, well, okay, fine. What's justice? What's environmental justice? What's energy justice? What is restorative energy justice? And I spent the better part of 2.5 years thinking about this question and going down to the state archives and listening to people like Henry, who's here with us today, who have been, I think, working on this topic for a long time without maybe calling it restorative energy justice. Restorative justice as an idea popped up in the criminal law context. It was a way to get away from, the idea that you just punish people and expect that that will fix all of our problems. And you try to rehabilitate folks that commit a crime. And how do you rehabilitate people? It's not about changing a person. It's about figuring out who was harmed by a crime, who committed the crime, get them together, talk it out, and figure out how you repair that relationship between people. It's really about relationships in the restorative justice framework. So coming from criminal law, and you find that environmental advocates have been using these ideas in a bunch of different ways. In Australia, what they call damage to Aboriginal heritage is outlawed by statute, and a couple of justices have described this as environmental crimes that can be best resolved with a restorative approach. Figure out who's harmed, talk to the folks who are causing the harm, get them together, and see if we can ask the right questions. Even here in the US, you'd be surprised the federal agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency does restorative justice. There's something called a supplemental environmental impact assessment, where essentially rather than fining folks for some damage to the environment, you just require folks to fix the damage. And then in the scholarly world, you have folks here at the UH Law School, like Kapua Sproat, one of my heroes, and Eric Yamamoto, another hero, have been using these restorative justice concepts to deal with things like climate change and indigenous self-determination, and what Eric Yamamoto called all the way back in 2001, racializing environmental justice, recognizing that our society's problems with racial divisions actually have tendrils that go out into every facet of modern society, including environmental impacts. So my restorative energy justice kind of dive followed Eric's path. And Eric said that there was essentially sort of a four-step path to figuring out how you repair some of these harms. He called them the four R's. No need to memorize the four R's, but recognition, responsibility, reconstruction, and repair. We were talking about what words we should use in this modern era. I think it's always a good idea to pick words that nobody can disagree with. And I'm not sure that anybody disagrees that things like responsibility and repair are bad in and of themselves. Maybe we can have disagreements about how they get applied, but as fundamental principles, these seem like things we can all buy into. So, how do you make this into an energy exercise? Well, I started with the idea that electric utilities and electricity are a big piece of our energy kind of puzzle. We know from lots of work that electric utilities everywhere, and Hawaii is no exception, wield a lot of power, economic power, political power, social power. And so what if we could just, look at this lens through ask the question of, does this lens of the four R's allow us to flip utility power, electric utility power on its head and create just outcomes? Leverage our utility system whose roots I'll talk about for good. And I think the answer to that question is we can. We just have to figure out who we ask about what the problems are we're trying to fix. If restorative justice means starting with figuring out who's been harmed and how, we have to understand who we ask that question to. I think in Hawaii, the place to start with that is to ask Hawaiians. And call me crazy, but I just feel like when you're in Hawaii, you should ask Hawaiians what matters to this place, what has mattered to this place in the past, and what will matter in the future. So why don't we do a thought experiment in the absence of a robust process whereby we all together go out and try to ask these questions of communities who have been impacted by the history of electricity and utilities in Hawaii? The thought experiment is, what might that story look like? What might the recognition of this history of electric utilities and electric utility regulation in Hawaii look like? If we don't accept the narrative that we all hear, and I've heard lots of narratives around this, but they usually start with wonky things like the regulatory compact, right? Name your wonky energy term here. You're all familiar with them and you all probably dislike them as much as I do. Let's just talk about history. Everybody's seen this picture before. Iolani Palace getting some lights back in 1886. That's not where the history of electricity in Hawaii actually starts. It actually starts on Maui at Sprecklesville at the sugar plantation. This was viewed as a technological triumph, and you have ali'i, members of the royal family, going to visit this to see what's going on. But if you really dig into it and ask why lights got installed at the Sprecklesville sugar plantation, the answer is so you could extract more labor from the people who worked at the plantation. Right? They could work into the night. That's what the lights were used for. That's not quite as rosy a narrative as other electricity narratives I've heard in Hawaii. That doesn't mean that the introduction of electricity at Iolani Palace is meaningless, but once again, I think the story might be a little bit different than the one we've told ourselves in the past. This is told oftentimes as the legacy of the Playboy King, King Kalakaua, who liked photography and liked sailing, liked electricity. These were just frivolities, Playboy frivolities. Or maybe we look at exactly when electric lights got turned on at Iolani Palace. And one of the first two times, it was during the King's Jubilee celebration, which was the same time he was trying to claw back some cultural sovereignty in the face of the bayonet constitution that had stripped away some of the political sovereignty of his kingdom. And the cultural sovereignty exercise was things like hula and melee for 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks straight. While that is happening, that's when King Kalakaua flips on the electric lights. And I just feel like there's something to that, right? There's something to the idea that this is about Kalakaua trying to take stock of where his kingdom was in the aftermath of the bayonet constitution, and think about how do we chart out a future that claws back some of those injuries. His vision was for a public power system. Iolani Palace was the first place that the lights got installed, but the very next step was to install the hydropower generator up in Nuuanu, run wires down Nuuanu Avenue, and bring lights to the public. So all of that happens in the 1880s, and in the interest of getting through this in the next 11 minutes, which I think is what we have left, we can't tell all the pieces of this story. But certainly, one of the pieces of the story that we can't ignore is the formation of Hawaiian Electric. It's now our dominant electric utility, and we should think about where it comes from. And again, you can tell that story starting in lots of places, but one of the places you might start is the end of the 1882, 1892, 1893 legislature, the legislative session in which we have King Kalakaua's successor, Queen Liliuokalani. She's trying to claw back some of that political sovereignty taken away by the Bayonet Constitution. So here she is. She's leaving the legislature at the end of the legislative session on January 14th. The story in her diary is that she was wearing black, not to mourn the death of her brother, but to mourn the loss of political sovereignty in the Bayonet Constitution. You can tell it was top of mind. Just 2 days before that happened, you get a bill passed out of the legislative session. Not much happened in that legislative session. It was just a power fight back and forth, right? Cabinets get formed, they get taken back, they get formed, they get taken back. But Bill 219 gets passed, and this gives the Minister of the Interior, Lauren Thurston at the time, the the right to sell at public auction an exclusive right and franchise to start an electric utility that would serve Honolulu. And it was limited in time. It was just a 10-year grant of that right. That happens on January 12th, 1893. I think it's March or May of that year that you get a group showing up on the steps of the palace and bidding for that exclusive right and franchise that came from Bill 19. And you know who won that bid? Who won that bid was the Hawaiian Electric Company with four founders, William Hall, Jonathan Austin, E.O. White, and William Lockwood. So they win the bid and they start on this enterprise of a private power system that in those days actually runs alongside the public power system that Kalakaua had started. All right, we actually have two power systems developing at the same time, a public one and a private one. Well, those of you who've been reading Hawaiian history or living Hawaiian history know that this same week, January 12th, January 14th, January 17th, something big happens. That's when you get troops step ashore from the USS Boston, and the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii commences in earnest on that day. A couple of pictures. I obsessed over these pictures for a few years. I was hopeful that what we saw here were power lines going into Iolani Hale. Those aren't power lines. It turns out they're communication lines. My hopes were dashed there. But here's another picture. I mean, this is a fellow by the name of John Soper, who becomes the head of the provisional government's military. He is discharging the Royal Guard. He's having them lay down their arms and telling them their services are no longer needed. And the reason I want to show you that picture is that you see his bowler hat and his white pants, because I'm assuming, although I don't know for sure, that around the same time you get this picture taken on the steps of Iolani Palace. This is the head of the military. This is like the chiefs of staff of the provisional government's military. You can see John Soper there in the middle of the picture. But if you go to the far right, a fellow in a beard holding something in white in his hand, that's a fellow by the name of William Hall. And you've seen that name before because William Hall was the first president of the Hawaiian Electric Companies. What was his role? Well, his role as president of Hawaiian Electric Companies was to start that company up and to create the utility that we still utilize today. His role for provisional government's military was as quartermaster. And I'll be honest, I didn't know what a quartermaster was when I started doing this research. Quartermaster is the person who supplies arms to the military, actually other supplies too, but gives arms to the military. And William Hall had been doing this for a long time. If you go and dig into some newspaper reports, you'll see him telling the story of how he was the one that gave the Honolulu Rifles their guns so they could go in and hold Kalakaua at bay and force him to sign the Bayonet Constitution. What's my point? My point is that this group of folks, while they were on on one day and one hat, they were electric utility executives. In another hat, they were integrally involved in the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And it's not just William Hall. Jonathan Austin was a drafter of the Bayonet Constitution. Right, he was a lawyer. He also strung up some early power lines between his office and the office next door. Um, I I I think this is interesting, but I think there is a fair number of us who would look at this and say, well, so what, right? People get to do political advocacy, and you may not agree with that political advocacy, or maybe you do, but so what? What does this have to do with the electric utility? And to that, I say, this isn't the only electric utility executives who talked about the overthrow. You've got C. Dudley Pratt, a descendant of missionary settlers who, close to 100 years later, is telling the story of Hawaiian Electric, and he talks about the overthrow, and he uses the words that start to hit me in the gut. Whatever the other effect of these actions, meaning the actions that preceded the overthrow, they created a favorable political climate in which local industries could begin to plan for the future. So, how about the president of Hawaiian Electric telling us that the acts of Hawaiian Electric's former president actually did have an impact on how our utility industry grew from its very inception? What do we mean plan for the future? Well, the kinds of things that happened very early on, right? You get that grant of an exclusive franchise right in 1894. You build the Alakea Power Station, which becomes the Honolulu Power Plant, which was the first power plant retired as Hawaiian Electric moves to decarbonization. Well, it's not retired really, it's mothballed, right? It's still there. The point is these things that were happening early on, whether political advocacy or setting up a utility, they have very long tails. We are still living with the decisions that were made back in 1894. This is true of all energy infrastructure. It is long lived, right? Waiau Power Plant, another example. All right, I'm going to wrap up my story within the next couple of minutes, but I want to tell you a little bit of a legal story that has implications for where we are today thinking about justice. And that is, go back, remember that Bill 219 that gave Hawaiian Electric the right to operate was actually a 10-year right. And so after 10 years, in 1903 and 1904, Hawaiian Electric has to go back to the legislature, what has then become the territorial legislature, and has to ask for an extension of their franchise right to keep operating their utility here in Honolulu. But some decisions of the territorial legislature required that the US Congress sign off on them. And so what happens is Hawaiian Electric succeeds in getting an extension of its franchise rights here in Hawaii for a fixed term of years. It's escaping right now how long that was. I know there was local debate in the newspapers about how long it should be. Sort of people looking at, should it be 15 years? Should it be 35 years? My memory says it maybe ended up around 30 years. That's what gets passed out of the territorial legislature. Then the same idea, the same request goes to the US Congress, and you get lobbyists from Hawaii, paid for by Hawaiian Electric, who lobby Congress to change that term. And I haven't been able to find much debate about it in Congress, but you can find from one draft of the bill to the next, the words for the next 30 years or 35 years get stricken out, and you get a grant of a franchise right to operate here in Honolulu in perpetuity. So the legal right to operate as a monopoly that is now regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, it is actually born out of a U.S. congressional action. And it's born out of a U.S. congressional action that was so far outside the norm at the time that it should have been shocking to everybody who looked at it. Across the country, across the world, you're finding that we're giving these monopoly rights for fixed terms of 15 or 20 years, and we get one here that lasts in perpetuity. So what? Well, I mean, the so what is what's happened since then? And going back to restorative justice, are there any harms that we can identify from this kind of evolution? I think the answer is yes, you can identify some harms. Some of them we've tried to deal with. Here's a newspaper article about you come back, you've got this now franchise right to operate in perpetuity. What do? Well, you don't want to have a public power system running alongside your private power system. So step one is let's buy up the public power system. So Hawaiian Electric leases the new Oahu power station. They later come to own the new Oahu power station. And public debate notices that this creates sort of a monopoly. That's where we get a Public Utilities Commission from in 1913, I think it is. Um, and then, perhaps putting it in terms that finally hit me in the most sort of tangible way. I don't think you can live in Hawaii for too long or educate yourself in Hawaii or be born in Hawaii without recognizing the long tail that agricultural sugar interests had in our modern kind of political, social infrastructure climate. The Big Five, we talk about the Big Five all the time. Here's a chart of the Big Five. It's those five circles in the middle of the chart on the screen. Sumner LaCroix, an economics professor, wrote a book here where he reproduced this chart. And he pointed out that what you've got going on here is you have the Big Five interlinked with all the other sort of mercantile enterprises of the time. They have the same boards, right? There's kind of incestuous boards. They've got many of the same owners and shareholders. And Hawaiian Electric is right there. I can't point it out to you because I can't reach that far over. But one of the smaller circles on the outside is Hawaiian Electric. And it fits the bill of what Sumner LaCroix described as the folks dominating Hawaii's economy. Well, how many of the big five are still around, right? They've become landholding companies for a couple of them have folded. But of those companies, maybe of the companies on this chart, which one has the largest market capitalization? Which one has the most customers in Hawaii? Which one sends us recipes every month that kind of keep us all socially tied together? I'd say Hawaiian Electric is actually the most direct vestige of this economic colonialism that was happening of any entity in the state. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I think that's a matter of perspective, but I think it's a historical fact. And in fact, I'm suggesting we start talking about the Big Six and not the Big Five. Okay, the rest of this takes 30 seconds because the implications are so far-reaching. I think you'd have to do a real process of exploring narratives with folks who actually know more about Hawaii than I do, right? That story I gave you is my story. I think there's a much richer story to be told. But if you go through the rest of the four R's, you get things like this. Responsibility. Well, that means looking back and making sure we talk about this, that we don't just sweep this under the rug. I'd suggest that Dudley Pratt was sweeping this whole thing under the rug and not taking responsibility for these actions as he described them. So something like an apology, right? Apology resolution is an example of this responsibility taking. I think that could be a useful step and would get us further along this path than we are today, would help a lot of the work that your folks are doing. Reconstruction, what Eric Yamamoto means by that is that you start to reconstruct institutions, social institutions that have been eroded by whatever history you're evaluating. I'd suggest that we have to think about reconstructing things like a public interest in the power system. Maybe the regulatory compact hasn't gone far enough. The obvious question about what you might reconstruct is ownership of the electric utility. And I know this is something that's been explored, and I think it's a little bit tired at this stage. In fact, there are reasons for and against having an investor-owned utility. But I did think it's interesting that when the Hawaii State Energy Office put a bunch of money and resources into evaluating different ownership options, 147 people showed up at the meetings to talk about it. Out of 1 million plus people statewide, get 147 talking about something. I don't think it captured it didn't capture the community spirit that I know is here in so many other sectors of Hawaii's social fabric. On the flip side, you get one protest about Kahuku Wind, you get more than 147 people showing up. So why is that? I don't think this is about utility ownership. I think it's about land, right? INA is so central to, but pre or post overthrow, the sort of existence of Kanakamali, that if we were to reframe these questions about what do our energy decisions mean for land, we'd probably get a lot more people involved and engaged. Particularly, there's a legal concept here. Native Hawaiians have a right of access and gathering on undeveloped lands. They don't have that same right. It gets extinguished on developed lands. Are we recognizing every time we take a piece of land and we develop it for renewable energy infrastructure that we have extinguished an indigenous right? I don't think we do talk about that, and perhaps we should. And then lastly, repair. Whether you want to talk about environmental repair or social repair, let me just give you a quick example of how I think this might work if we had a process like this to work alongside distributive justice and procedural justice. Lots of stories told in the narrative about the Waiau power plant, which is still there, right? Started to be built in 1937, and stories of heroism in the face of attacks in World War II to keep the lights on for the military and a growing population fed by the military. What are the ramifications of all of that? Um, Breaks my heart. I take my son bike riding behind the Waiau power plant. It smells like oil, and you see folks fishing and growing taro right next to water sources that are so polluted you can't go in them. I actually don't know if this pollution has anything to do with the Waiau power plant. I don't want to make accusations there without having the facts. But nonetheless, I see a harm here. A harm is definitely related to the development of energy infrastructure in this realm. That smell of oil, no doubt, has to do with the oil pipeline that the bike path runs along. And lo and behold, you've got Hawaiian Electric and community groups going out there and they're replanting and they're trying to clean that area up and to sort of repair it. That's only possible because you have an institution that's going to do it. They've acknowledged some responsibility, and I think that responsibility comes from the recognition. That's my pitch about restorative justice being a useful way to think about these things and a set of questions to ask. And I'm sorry it was a little bit long-winded.
Oh, no, not at all. Thank you, Richard.